Bear with me for a moment and take a BuzzFeed-style quiz to open this unit. I'm going to read you a list of statements to determine how much of a capital R romantic you are. On a scrap piece of paper or on your hand, mark down an A if you agree with a statement or a D if you disagree. Let's go. The answer to life's most troubling questions can be found through discussions with a simple person who lives in the country, close to nature, not with a sophisticated person from the city. Do you agree or disagree? And please excuse my kitten Florence's contributions there. She is also taking the quiz. How about this statement? Connecting with nature can give answers to troubling questions. Agree or disagree? The use of imagination is more important than rational thought. Do you agree or disagree? Subjectivity, considering things on a case-by-case basis, is more important than objectivity, universal rules. How about this one? Knowledge is gained through gut reactions and hunches rather than deductive thought. A, if you agree. D, if you disagree. Nature is more important than art. Do you agree or disagree? Experimental trial and error is a better process than the conventional scientific method with a hypothesis, etc. Agree or disagree? Poetry should be spontaneous and full of emotion, not planned and straightforward. Agree or disagree? How about this one? Sensitivity, feelings, and spontaneity are more important than intellectualism. Agree or disagree? And then finally, do you agree or disagree with this statement? Dare to be is a better battle cry than dare to know. Now, count up your A's, or the number of statements you agreed with. What did you get? The higher your number, the more closely you are identifying with the values of the Romantic movement. When I take this quiz, I usually get a 7 or 8, depending on my mood that particular day. So you can see why Romanticism is one of my favorite movements in literature. Let's take a look at these values in depth, what they are, how they began, and what they mean for literature. Romanticism is both a philosophical and an aesthetic or art movement, which means that you see Romanticism in visual arts, theater, music, and literature, as well as social movements. If you have studied art history or received classical training on an instrument or your voice, you may have run into Romanticism before. The movement draws its intellectual underpinnings from the philosophical writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whom we met last week. It emerged in Western Europe and Russia in the late 18th century and made it to the US in the early decades of the 19th century. Here are some characteristics of Romanticism. First of all, it is important to understand that it was a reaction against the empiricism and rationalism of the Enlightenment. Romantics had had enough of scientific method and universal laws and wanted to explore aspects of human life they felt the Enlightenment had neglected. For this reason, Romanticism places a high value on emotionalism, arguing that human feelings are more important than reason. Another aspect of Romanticism is naturalism. Romantic artists of all media praise the spontaneity of rural people over the ideals of the upper classes. We can see this in the interest in folk music during this time period. Many traditional ballads and folk songs were collected in these years, for instance, and even in fairy tales and folk tales. This is the time when the Brothers Grimm were collecting their famous stories from people throughout what would one day be Germany. A very important sub-movement within Romanticism was Gothicism. I'll talk more about this in a few weeks when we read Gothic short stories. For now, just know that this sub-movement was responsible for an interest in medieval art, in architecture, and even literature, as compared to the Enlightenment's interest in classical Greece and Rome, a movement called neoclassicism. Another aspect of Romanticism is its interest in the individual. For Romantics, the meaning of life involved finding and expressing oneself. It is during this time that we get the idea of the artist as genius, and that heroes are those who challenge social and moral norms. The Romantics also placed great emphasis on exoticism. They were interested in alternate modes of living and non-Western European cultures, especially the Near East, Northern Africa, Spain, and Italy. However, the exoticism, sometimes called Orientalism, reinforced cultural stereotypes at the same time that it celebrated them. I'll move on now to some key themes across Romantic literature and art, starting with the theme of revolution, democracy, and republicanism. The Romantics believed that people are basically good, and for that reason, they advocated for social causes like abolition, workers' rights, and women's rights. The beginning decades of Romanticism were known as the Age of Revolution, with the American, French, and Haitian revolutions following close on each other's heels. Another broad theme of Romanticism was nature. The Romantics viewed nature as a place where God dwells, and believed that nature has the ability to teach humans truths about life. As a side note, this is the romantic aspect that I personally am most in line with. However, please understand that the Romantics had a very specific and perhaps different conception of nature than we do in the 21st century. They equated nature with the sublime, an idea that spread across fine arts and literature. In fact, during this slideshow, I've been trying to incorporate Romantic art so that you can see how the visual arts interpreted the idea of the sublime. Today, we might use the word sublime to describe a particularly tasty cheesecake, but the word has a much different meaning to Romantics. The sublime for them describes the experiences of awe, terror, danger, and beauty. It is usually applied to nature, as we see in this very famous Romantic painting by Friedrich, Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. Something sublime is both beautiful and terrifying at the same time. This is nature in its elemental power, not bunnies hopping across a meadow nibbling on daisies. I love bunnies, by the way, and own one, but he's not sublime. Be on the lookout for sublime elements in the Romantic poetry assigned for this week. How do Coleridge and Blake depict nature? How is this different from the cutified nature we think of today? I'll turn now to how Romanticism directly manifested itself in literature of the time period, usually defined as 1789 to 1832, though with debate among scholars over the outer boundaries of the range. As briefly mentioned before, the Romantics introduced a new mode, the Gothic. There was a revived interest in medieval literature, in all its messy, fantastical forms, but especially the medieval romance, which the medieval romance is basically an adventure tale, often with supernatural elements. Folk tales and folk poetry were of great interest, and of course, nature was a popular theme. Famous Romantic authors include William Wordsworth, author of Nuns Fret Not from Week 2 homework, his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Rime of the Ancient Mariner from this week's reading, the German playwright and novelist Goethe, author of Faust and the Sorrows of Young Werther, the Shelleys, Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, and her husband, the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, their friend Lord Byron, whom you may have heard of before, and the French Romantic novelist Victor Hugo, popular for Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Since our theme this week is Romantic poetry, I'll talk a little about some poetry sub-movements. The first is the Lake School, named for the Lake District, a beautiful area of northern England where many of them lived. You see here a photo I took of the Derwentwater, one of the Lake District lakes, with rolling hills and mist hanging low in the distance. Very romantic. The Lake School was made up of the poets William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and Robert Southey. Wordsworth and Coleridge were often credited with kick-starting Romanticism in literature with their publication of lyrical ballads in 1791. Another school of poets was the so-called Satanic School, so named by the Lake School poet Robert Southey, as an insult. Some examples of Satanic School poets include Lord Byron, who's pictured here, and Percy Bysshe Shelley. Known for their unorthodox lifestyles, these poets were certainly flamboyant and risque, even for their own times. By the way, if you've watched the Bridgerton series on Netflix, this is a time period when the Satanic School was in full power. The society excesses you see in some of the episodes of Bridgerton will give you an idea of how these poets lived their lives. We can learn a lot about a literary movement from whom they idolize, and the Romantics idolized Shakespeare worldwide. While Shakespeare had never fallen into oblivion, he was certainly not as popular in the 1700s as he was in the 1800s. This was a European sensation, by the way. The statue you see pictured here is from Weimar, Germany, home of the Romantic writer Goethe. Weimar holds an annual Shakespeare conference that I attended in 2017 when I took this picture. I was so surprised, but also delighted to see how much the Germans love Shakespeare. This is also where I saw Hamlet, all in German with a drone playing the role of Fortinbras, but I digress. Why was Shakespeare so popular? Well, his works contained many aspects the Romantics were striving to include in their works. Shakespeare did not bother with Aristotle's classical unities of drama, a time, place, and action. He mixed meter in his plays, mixed poetry with prose even. His plays often have a subtext of common or lower-class characters, and there is often violent emotion and actions, as well as comic relief. All of these aspects fit right in with the Romantic literary aesthetic, making Shakespeare very, very popular. I'll list a few more influential European writers and musicians in the Romantic movement here. William Blake, whose Tiger is on the reading list for this week, was both a poet and an artist who illustrated his own work. You can see some of his engravings in the middle section of the Norton. Sir Walter Scott, a Scottish poet and novelist, first made the historical fiction genre widely popular with his Waverley novels, many of which were set in Scotland. The Romantics loved Scotland for its folksy ways, its rugged and isolated landscape, and the tragedy of the Jacobite uprisings. Although Germans definitely contributed to Romantic literature with authors like Goethe, perhaps their most important contribution to Romanticism worldwide was in the field of music. Composers such as Beethoven, Brahms, Liszt, Mendelssohn, and Schubert, to name a few, created Romantic masterpieces. And I've already mentioned Victor Hugo's Romanticism contributions in an earlier slide. This is the first time we've spoken of American literature, other than Popol Vuh, in my world literature classes. The American Romantic movement began a bit later than the European movement. It peaked from the 1820s to the end of the Civil War. American Romanticism followed the same ideals as European Romanticism, though with its own twist. If you've ever read transcendentalist writers like Ralph Waldo Emerson or Henry David Thoreau, then you've experienced the American philosophical take. Some Romantic authors of note include Washington Irving, who wrote folktales like Rip Van Winkle and The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, James Fenimore Cooper's historical fiction novels like The Last of the Mohicans, Nathaniel Hawthorne, whom we'll read in a few weeks, and of course our friend Edgar Allan Poe, whose The Raven is on the docket for this week. I look forward to following the discussion boards and looking over your responses to the Romanticism worksheet. Have a great week, and in the spirit of Romanticism, try to get some nature in your life if you can this week.